Well, this is a story that I really like, and I wanted to share it with you. This goes back to World War II. So, in the fall of 1943, as thousands of Jews were being rounded up by the Nazis in Nazi-occupied Italy, and they were being shipped off to concentration camps at the height of the worst of the liquidation of the Jews and others during World War II, but of course, primarily the Jews in terms of numbers. A group of dissident doctors, they figured out a way to save dozens of lives. Now, this is from a great article from Mental Floss, and Cyrus will get a link posted to this so you can read it. But the story basically is this: they fabricated a disease. They called it Syndrome K. And keep in mind that the Nazis were ruthlessly roaming around searching for Jews to round them up and ship them off to their deaths in the concentration camps. So these doctors, they decided to trick the Nazis, and they were successful in doing so, by telling them that there was this horrible disease that was extremely disfiguring and very contagious. And if you got anywhere near anybody who had this disease, it would kill you. And that made the Nazis scared. Here's how the Mental Floss story explains it. 60 years later, we're now finding out about what happened then. The Nazis had raided a Jewish ghetto near Rome's Tiber River. As the Jews were being rounded up, some of the doctors, some of whom were Catholic, by the way, hid a number of runaways inside the walls of a nearby hospital. It was then that the doctors, including Vittorio Sacerdoti, he was Jewish, by the way, and a surgeon named Giovanni Borromeo, came up with a plan to diagnose the refugees with a fictitious disease. They called it Syndrome K. To pull it off, the Nazis had to believe that these patients had a lethal disease that could infect anyone who came in contact with them. In the cramped quarters of deportation trains, one sick passenger could infect everyone on board, including the soldiers. The name Syndrome K came from Dr. Adriano Ossicini. He was a physician who was working at that hospital, and he realized that they needed a way to differentiate the people in the hospital who were actually patients as well as the Jews who were coming in. And so he invented this fake disease so that everybody would know who's who. So when a doctor came in with a quote-unquote Syndrome K patient, everyone who was working there, they knew that they had to take certain steps. Syndrome K was put on a patient's papers to indicate that the sick person wasn't sick at all, but Jewish. The doctor told the Italian newspaper La Stampa, "We created those papers for the Jews as if they were ordinary patients, and in the moment when we had to say what disease they suffered, it was Syndrome K, meaning I'm admitting a Jew, as if he were ill, but they were all healthy." The idea to call it Syndrome K came from the name of the Nazi commander who was the chief in charge of Hitler's Italian occupation, as well as the main guy responsible for rounding up the Jews and the mass reprisal that took place. It was a massive killing of thousands of people in 1944. So both of their last names started with a K, Kesselring and Kappler. Albert Kesselring was the Nazi commander in charge of the occupation of Italy, and Herbert Kappler was the SS chief responsible for that mass reprisal killing. So they named this fictitious disease after these two guys, Syndrome K. It was successful, and the doctors had to resort to certain tricks to try to make sure that the Nazis who would come to the hospital and they would try to find to see if somebody's hiding in there, they would teach the patients, and especially children, how to cough very violently behind closed doors so that would ward off any inspections from curious Nazis. The Nazis, according to Dr. Sacerdoti, the Nazis thought that it was a cancer or a tuberculosis, and they fled like rabbits. Syndrome K hit close to home for Sacerdoti, who used this disease in order to save his 10-year-old cousin, Luciana Sacerdoti. So Dr. Sacerdoti was Jewish, and he was able to save his own family member, a little 10-year-old girl, by admitting her with that quote-unquote disease. When more than half a century later the doctor's fabrication was finally revealed, they became recognized for their life-saving actions. Dr. Borromeo was recognized as righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem, a World Holocaust Remembrance Center. He was also integral in orchestrating the transfer of many Jewish patients from hospitals in the ghettos to that hospital in Italy in order to get them better treatment and a safer environment before the raids began. The hospital itself was even recognized as a house of life by the International Raoul Wallenberg Foundation, which advocates on behalf of Holocaust survivors. In the years leading up to the raids, the hospital had become known as a haven for persecuted Jews. The hospital administration at the time, including the doctors aforementioned, including Dr. Borromeo, they allowed doctors like Sacerdoti, a Jew who had been fired from previous jobs because of his being Jewish. And they allowed him to work in this hospital under false documents. Great story. And it's all the more great, it seems to me, because those unsung heroes didn't say a word about it. They didn't try to attract attention to themselves in all those decades, and only recently has that come out. And Cyrus will be posting a link to that article so you can read it for yourself. There's also a movie being made about this. Now, it's not, I don't think, a big budget movie, but there's a movie. We'll get a link to that posted as well. And currently, there's no video that I can see, but there are plenty of interesting pictures of some of these people. And this leads to another topic that I want to share with you briefly, and that has to do with the persistent myth that Pope Pius XII was in favor of what Hitler did to the Jews. There was actually a book that purported this. The book was called Hitler's Pope by John Cornwell. And interestingly, the thesis of the book was that Pope Pius XII was deeply sympathetic to the anti-Semitism of the Nazis, when in fact the opposite is actually what's true. But this book became an international bestseller, and it was regarded as the gospel truth. People believed that Pope Pius XII didn't do anything to help the Jews, and that the Catholic Church was callous and couldn't care less, especially in Italy, and especially in Rome, when the Nazis had occupied Italy during the latter half of World War II. That narrative is completely false. So much so, by the way, that the author of that book, Hitler's Pope, later, much to his credit, I believe, he publicly recanted aspects of the book that after he was able to, consult scholarship that he hadn't seen before, I want to put the best face on it possible, he realized that his thesis was wrong. I'll give you an example. When I read Hitler's Pope when it first came out, probably 20 years ago, whatever it was almost laughable. So, for example, delving into the life of Eugenio Pacelli, who became Pope Pius XII, and little details like this. So one that sticks out of my mind is that the author is claiming that when Eugenio Pacelli was in kindergarten, there was a teacher who taught in the school, might have been his own teacher, who was known at the time for being anti-Semitic. That's all. That's the whole point there. And from that, spinning it out of whole cloth, the author, he insinuated that, well, obviously then Eugenio Pacelli would have become anti-Semitic too, because there was a teacher in the school who was anti-Semitic. Therefore, that proves the point that he grew up being anti-Semitic, when it proves no such point. So here are a few details from that episode in church history that are worth knowing. In case somebody tells you, well, the Catholic Church was silent, or Pope Pius XII was silent, here are the real details. First of all, remember that Pope Pius XII, before he was elected Pope, he was assigned, and he had other duties. So he was the Secretary of State under Pope Pius XI, who was the Pope who immediately preceded him. But even before that, he, as a diplomat for the Vatican, he spent the better part of 10 years in Germany as what would be the equivalent of a papal nuncio to Germany. So he was there in Berlin. He spoke fluent German. He lived there, as I say, for the better part of 10 years. He was moving in diplomatic circles. So he knew the people involved in Hitler's rise to power. He knew them. And he knew what they were planning to do and what they began to do. So by the time he leaves his post as a papal diplomat in Germany, speaking fluent German and seeing with his own eyes what's going on there, he's then called back to Rome, and he becomes a Secretary of State under Pope Pius XI. Now, it's under Pope Pius XI at the eve of the Second World War, when Pope Pius XI issued an encyclical that was aimed directly at the Nazis, directly at what was going on in Germany. The name of the encyclical in German is Mit brennender Sorge, which means with anxious heart. And that encyclical, which strongly, directly condemned the Nazis, condemned Hitler's final solution, the idea of rounding up Jews and killing them, it was ghostwritten by Eugenio Pacelli. Now, went out over the name of Pope Pius XI, but this is often done. Often encyclical letters reflect the teaching of a given pope, but they are drafted or even, in some cases, ghostwritten by somebody else altogether. So in this case, the message was coming from Pope Pius XI to the Nazis, but it was really drafted and thought of by Eugenio Pacelli, who became Pope Pius XII. Now, you can read this online, and you can see this stern rebuke of what was happening in Germany just before the Civil War, or not Civil War, just as World War II was unfolding. So during World War II, what happened? Well, this story that I shared with you a few minutes ago about Syndrome K is a good example of how Catholics and others, but since, we're talking about Catholics here in the Catholic Church, they very bravely and selflessly risked their own lives to shelter Jews. So they would hide them in convents and monasteries and in hospitals and anywhere they could that they could shelter these people. Otherwise, they would get rounded up and taken to Auschwitz and gassed. So this went on for several years. In fact, Pope Pius XII, as Pope, he ordered all of the convents, the religious sisters and the religious communities and parish priests, he sent out an order that they had to take Jews in and shelter them from the roving bands of German soldiers who were searching for them. So this was something that, even if maybe Mother Superior didn't quite feel like doing it, the Pope said you have to do it, so they did it. Pope Pius XII also recognized that certain tactics would backfire. So, for example, in Holland, this is when Anne Frank and her family were hiding in the attic in their secret location in Holland. This is before the Nazis found her. The clergy of the church in Holland, and this extended to a number of Protestant groups as well, but the bishops and the priests in Holland, they decided that on a particular Sunday, they were going to, from the pulpit, read a prepared statement that would be a direct rebuke, a direct attack on Hitler and Nazi Germany, who, by the way, were occupying Holland at that time. I believe this was in 1943. And so they did. So on that Sunday, as with one voice, all these different Catholic priests and the bishops who did the same thing, they publicly attacked, they publicly denounced Nazism and Hitler and what was going on. And guess what happened? At this point, Holland was just being occupied. But this so angered them that once this announcement was made, they went on a rampage. And they decided they were going to just tear everything apart to find as many Jews as they can. That's why Anne Frank, by the way, was rounded up and sent to the death camps, and that's why she and her family perished there. Had it not been, as we look back with 2020 hindsight, had it not been for the fact that those priests had bravely, I would say it was a very brave move for them to make. I don't fault them for it, and they didn't know what the result was going to be. Maybe they thought that the Nazis would come to their senses and back off a little bit, but the Nazis went in the other direction. And they said, oh yeah, we'll show you. And had it not been for that, then Anne Frank almost certainly would have survived. So Pope Pius XII saw this, and he recognized if you do it that way, it's very likely that more Jews will die because Hitler wasn't backing down. So, in order to play it safe, for the Jews' sake, that is, not for his own sake, he did other things. And so among the other things that he did was to order that as many Jews as possible be taken in and hidden and given fake certificates to show that they were actually employed in places and other things like that. And there are many stories that abound on this, and we don't have time to go into all those stories. However, I will say this, that when World War II was over, and it was shortly after the ending of World War II, that ended in 1945, well, in 1948, the State of Israel was created, and all the heads of the new State of Israel, Golda Meir and all the other top people in the Israeli government, they had just lived through World War II. So it was fresh in their minds. They knew everybody who was involved. And you know what they did? When Pope Pius XII died in 1958, so 10 years after the founding of the State of Israel, they honored him nationally. They honored him publicly by planting in the Negev desert I believe the number was about 600,000 trees in the desert as a living memorial, as a tribute to Pope Pius XII for all that he had done to protect and to help the Jews. And the reason they planted 600,000 trees was because they reckoned that that was somewhere in the neighborhood of the number of Jews that he had helped save personally by his actions. Did he ever come out on the balcony and shout at Hitler and denounce him? No, but he didn't need to do that. In fact, he saw that doing that would lead to even worse reprisals against the Jews. So he worked quietly, feverishly in the background. He loved coffee, by the way, as most of us do. And during the height of all this, he decided that he would not only not eat much food, but he also went without coffee as a kind of penance, because he said that if the Jews in camps were allowed to have coffee, which they weren't, then I won't have coffee either, in solidarity with them. So the Israeli government, they honored him for his heroic work behind the scenes to save many Jews, and it's well worth your time to read the true story about Pope Pius XII. I have a chapter about this whole situation in my book, Pope Fiction, Answers to 30 Myths and Misconceptions About the Papacy. We'll come back and we'll take phone calls and get into more things that I think you're going to find very interesting. I'll be right back.
For more of The Patrick Madrid Show, visit relevantradio.com/Patrick.